Hello, you're watching Ukraine This Week. Join me, Jonasz Rewiński, as we bring you the latest updates on Ukraine's struggle from the corridors of power to the fields of battle. Ukraine has introduced a landmark reform allowing soldiers to transfer between military units, aiming to improve morale and operational efficiency. Announced in early November, the policy is facilitated through the digital platform known as Army Plus.
Previously, soldiers were permanently tied to their units, some under poor leadership, leading to desertions and inefficiencies. Last year alone, over 16,000 desertion cases were reported. The reform, a result of collaboration between civil society and military leaders, allows soldiers to request transfers within specified categories, including combat to combat or other roles. Applications, which take 15 to 20 minutes to complete, require minimal paperwork and are decided within 72 hours. Over 500 transfers have been approved since the platform's launch, with close to 500,000 soldiers registered. Safeguards ensure operational stability, including a requirement to serve 6 months in the current unit and commander approvals for certain cases.
Though modest in scale, Ukrainian help to Syrian rebels showcases Kyiv's unyielding effort to undermine Russian influence in the region. According to the Washington Post, Ukrainian military intelligence supplied approximately 150 drones, as well as trained operators, to the dominant rebel group in Idlib. This covert support contributed to the recent overthrow of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad.
Kyiv's involvement reflects a broader strategy of challenging Russian-backed regimes far from its borders. Ukrainian officials have hinted at such operations before, with military intelligence earlier this year showcasing rebel strikes on Russian targets in Syria. A special Ukrainian military unit, known as Khimik, reportedly led these efforts in collaboration with the Syrian opposition. The Kremlin has accused Kyiv of conducting dirty operations and even attempting to recruit Syrian fighters for its own war effort. Claims of a drones for fighters deal, however, remain unverified.
The United States has approved a $20 billion loan to Ukraine, supplied by interest earned on frozen Russian assets, part of a G7 support package. The Biden administration confirmed the loan on the 10th of December, fulfilling its pledge to provide the funds before President-elect Donald Trump takes office on the 20th of January.
Ukraine, reliant on Western aid to resist Russia's invasion about to enter its third year, faces an uncertain future. Trump has criticized U.S. support levels, despite expressing interest in a Lend-Lease program. The latest loan is expected to sustain Ukraine's defense and essential services into early 2025. The loan announcement comes after months of deliberation between the U.S. and its allies about the use of frozen Russian assets, valued at hundreds of billions of dollars, for Ukrainian aid without infringing on international law.
Ukraine has unveiled its first underground surgical hospital in Zaporizhia, designed to withstand Russian attacks targeting medical facilities. The facility itself, spanning 500 square meters, can handle 200 patients daily and perform up to 4 simultaneous surgeries.
President Volodymyr Zelenskyy visited the hospital and praised its team for saving over 1,000 lives since opening. The underground hospital is equipped with advanced medical technology and robust infrastructure to treat wounded soldiers evacuated directly from the battlefield. President Zelenskyy toured the surgical and intensive care units personally, inspecting the equipment and living conditions of medical staff. Official talks in Kharkiv have mentioned plans for an ambitious underground town, designed to protect residents. The proposed 236,000 square meter complex would feature schools, medical centers, shopping areas and other amenities, with entry points through metro stations and a surface park.
And now it's time for the latest battlefield update from Ukraine, taking into account the latest developments. Now, from December 2024, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast faces a potential threat from Russian invaders. Ongoing Russian offensive operations are characterized by high casualty rates, but Moscow continues to pursue its strategy of incremental territorial gains. Russian forces may seek to extend their influence further into central Ukraine. The Dnipropetrovsk region is less densely populated than Donetsk. It is less urbanized in the east, so fighting there could take on a different character. In the open steppes of Ukraine, there is simply nowhere to hide. As a result, enemy movements across open terrain will be at a considerable risk. Now, Russia is pursuing another strategy, namely the push to capture the remaining parts of Donetsk Oblast, with a focus on Pokrovsk. The city's strategic value lies in its role as a logistical and transport hub for Ukrainian forces, crucial for supporting operations on the Eastern Front. A Ukrainian battalion commander in the Pokrovsk area described the situation as critical, noting that each Russian battalion-sized formation receives about 200 new personnel per month. Russian forces were attacking Ukrainian positions up to 30 times a day, with an artillery advantage still present. Another Ukrainian brigade officer reported that Russian forces had lost nearly 3,000 men in the direction of Pokrovsk in 2 weeks. Continued Russian losses on this scale will impose a growing cost on Russia's already strained force generation capabilities. Russian forces may well continue to make gains towards Pokrovsk, but the losses they incur in the process will limit their ability to translate these gains into wider offensive operations. Volodymyr Zelenskyy has surprised the international community with his praise of US President-elect Donald Trump following talks in Paris. Zelenskyy lauded Trump as one of the few leaders feared by Russian President Vladimir Putin and expressed gratitude for his determination to end the war in Ukraine.
Describing his Paris visit as very productive, Zelenskyy once again reiterated the need for strong guarantees and decisive action in ending the war in a post on the platform X.
We know that America has the capacity to accomplish remarkable things that others have not been able to achieve. To succeed in ending this war, we need the unity of America, Europe, and everyone in the world who values security, as well as strong positions and guarantees for peace.
Zelenskyy has also signaled openness to deploying Western troops in Ukraine as part of its security framework, contingent on clear timelines for Ukraine's NATO and EU membership. The surprising remarks came as Donald Trump reiterated his call for an immediate ceasefire and peace negotiations. However, concerns remain over Trump's ambiguous strategy, with many fearing it would include slashing military aid to Kyiv or conceding Ukrainian territory. Meanwhile, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, a known Kremlin sympathizer, engaged in a diplomatic tête-à-tête with both Trump and Putin. Despite Hungary positioning itself as a just mediator, its stance has drawn EU criticism for legitimizing Russia's territorial claims. While the risks posed by potential US policy shifts under Trump continue to haunt Kyiv, Ukraine remains financially and militarily prepared to sustain its defense through mid-2025, according to Finance Minister Serhiy Marchenko.
And now it's time for a more in-depth look at the latest developments. Joining us now are Mark Toth, national security expert, and Roy Barrett-Johnson, military expert at the Kazimir Pulaski Foundation. Hello and welcome to Ukraine this week.
Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo for having me.
So let us begin with the latest updates from the ongoing great game of diplomacy. Donald Trump has already received the accolade of being the Person of the Year from Time magazine, and he also made some rather enlightening comments concerning where this is going to go next. Right? Mark Toth, what do you think about the latest statements? These included both the assurance that Ukraine needs to survive as a strong country and should not be abandoned, but also that long-range missiles supplied by the US Army should not really be used against Russian targets because this may result in the conflict escalating. Slightly contradictory statements, aren't they?
Right. I think during this transition period, before he takes office on January 20th, I'd caution viewers to overread into anything that Trump or his team is saying. A lot of this is just kabuki theater playing out. A lot of it's posturing. A lot of it is just Trump doing what Trump does, which is try to create chaos because he thinks chaos is the best way to negotiate deals. So, from my perspective, from a national security standpoint, I wouldn't over-invest in those statements yet. Obviously, they're not helpful. Clearly, ATACMS are needed, have been needed since the opening days of the war to be able to fight the deep fight in Ukraine and take that deep fight inside of Russia. So for him to be saying that is certainly not helpful. Russia shows no signs of slowing its slow incremental advances into the Donetsk and elsewhere. And so I don't see why, it's helpful to Trump from a negotiating standpoint to be suggesting or indicating that Ukraine might not be able to counter with these precision strikes after he takes office. But at this point, I would just caution, let's a little bit of patience here. Let's just not get too caught up in the wording yet. Time will tell which it will be. But again, I would be hopeful because he certainly holds the winning cards. Putin, in a lot of ways, as we've just seen in Syria, he's on his back feet in a lot of different areas of the world. And in my estimation, there's no need to start conceding items on the negotiating table before he gets there.
So, Robert F. Johnson, do you think that this perhaps might be the statement that everyone is expecting, i.e., we want peace negotiations, we don't want the so-called escalation, so we need to say, look, please do exercise caution. But at the same time, this statement is made before we even know what is going to be the negotiating position of Vladimir Putin. Because the big question is Putin going to sit down at the table at all? If he does not, it is likely that the Trump administration will face a choice. Basically, we either concede that we have made a huge blunder by promising that this conflict will end 24 hours, or we need to provide more weapons in order to reinforce our position. You either sit down at the table and negotiate, or you face an unsustainable situation on the battlefield.
Well, I'm forced to agree with my esteemed colleague that in any way limiting the Ukrainians' use of any weaponry given to them now or in the future is an extremely bad move, because it's the only thing that's really cutting off the Russians' ability to prosecute the war. The other factor we might think about is that not only is Putin on his back foot in other parts of the world, but internally he's got huge problems now. They're just getting worse by the day. Interest rates are now up to 21% in Russia, per the instructions of the head of the central bank. And you have people like Sergei Chemezov, who is Putin's long time buddy. They were together in East Germany during the Cold War as working in the KGB station. And he now runs Rostec, which controls most of the Russian defense industry. And he says, with these interest rates, all of these defense companies will go bankrupt. No one can survive. And just in the last few days, one of the leading designers at one of the Russian missile design bureaus, who is responsible for guidance systems, was assassinated by a Ukrainian hit team near his home outside of Moscow. So Putin's feeling pressure from all different sides. And we have an idea of what his negotiating position will be, or I have my own thoughts on that, but we won't know really what the Trump position is until General Keith Kellogg travels to Moscow to sit down to talk with Putin and presents the actual talking points for the United States.
So we also had an unofficial indication from a person close to Putin's inner circle, basically a Russian oligarch, Konstantin Malofeyev, a rather unwholesome individual, also husband to a person wanted for war crimes, the infamous commissioner who basically oversaw the process of taking Ukrainian children from occupied territories into Russia. He said, well, if Keith Kellogg goes to Moscow, we should probably say he should, well, this statement was a bit harsh. Let's just say we should ignore everything that he has to say because he has nothing to offer, right? So, Mark Toth, do you think that this is what's going to happen, that Russia is going to ultimately reject these proposals, whatever they are, because they have set their sights on subjugating Ukraine, and they will not even accept the fairly generous idea of, clinging to some of the territories, even though they will not be legally transferred to them. They will want to go all in.
Yeah, I think we've got to separate the answer into two parts. One, what we're seeing out of a gentleman like him, and even just Dmitry Medvedev earlier today, saying that Ukraine's facing a choice, that either it's going to be with Russia or it's going to disappear from the map. That's a lot of posturing. That's just simply, and Mr. Johnson is exactly right, on a lot of different fronts, including an economic front. Russia is in deep, deep trouble. You can be spending upwards of 6%, and if not higher, of your GDP on defense spending, as it's rumored Russia is doing. But if you've got mass inflation at 10% and beyond, it's going to eat into the ability for that to be an effective expenditure. So I think a lot of that is just a pit bull barking. It's trying to warn you that to win in the negotiating table what they can't win on the battlefield. So I would be kind of wary of that. From my perspective, I think when you look to General Kellogg, you look to his background. This is a man who has, a strong grasp of the situation that Putin is facing. This is not a man who's easily fooled. Last week, when he was confronted with those very comments from the Russian oligarch, he laughed them off. In fact, just in the last week, I've penned an article with Colonel John Sweet, my writing colleague, basically saying that General Kellogg's going to find himself in a position of probably saying nuts a lot to his Putin negotiators that are sent to the table, that they're going to demand a lot, but they don't have the strength yet on the battlefield and their economy or what their outlook is, around the world in places like Syria. Because it's not just Syria that's at risk. Syria was a logistics hub for the Sahel. And back to Mr. Johnson's point, which is a great one, the Sahel is funding through, the absconding of funds of gold from Sudan and the like. That Sahel region across Africa is creating immense wealth for Russia that they need. And now if that's cut off because they're logistically cut off from it, that's only going to compound the problems that Putin is facing. So from that standpoint, I like the hand that General Kellogg holds. Now, how it gets played out, he's obviously just the envoy. As Mr. Johnson pointed out, we're going to have to wait and see. Until he arrives there, we're not going to know. But what we do know, I'd add just quickly here, we do know that the Ukrainians have already had a seat at the table. Yermak, Zelensky's chief advisor, chief of staff, if you will, has already met with J.D. Vance. He's met with Mike Waltz, the incoming national security advisor. They've at least gotten to the Trump administration first in Washington to start to lay the groundwork for how they see this shaping up.
And Ukraine has expressed its openness towards negotiations, of course, taking into account its own security interests, namely the NATO question, which is another thing. But before we actually move on to this, Robin F. Johnson, we've already mentioned envoys, specifically Keith Kellogg, but there are more people who would like to be perceived as fulfilling that role. One of them, apparently, is the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban. Do you think that his role could be perceived as constructive in any way? I'm talking from many different standpoints. From the standpoint of the European Union, clearly it is not, because he is acting as if he actually has his own agenda, never mind that he's supposed to represent the EU, given that they are still running the presidency until the end of the year. But he seems to be playing his own game. But would you say that he has gained anything by doing so, apart from maybe applause from a domestic audience?
Well, he's received an invite to attend the Trump inauguration, and we still don't know if he's coming or not. It's a fact that if Orban is involved in any meaningful way, um, there are people not only in Ukraine but also in Poland who are going to, reach for their wallet and say that they're going to be very, very skeptical about his intentions. And the other point that everyone is sort of left out of this whole discussion about Ukraine and what happens next is the role played by Belarus. There's quite a bit of justification for suspecting that if Orban takes a role as a mediator, Lukashenko will try and insert himself into the process. So it's, in the opinion of many people who follow this a lot closer on any given day than I do, Orban as a mediator is probably not the most productive choice that there is. And also to go back to a previous question, and I thank my esteemed colleagues for complimenting me. But the one point I wanted to make that I don't hear a lot of, I hear a lot about discussions about, well, maybe Ukraine should be in NATO, maybe it shouldn't. What about territory? What about this? What I don't hear is I don't hear any discussions about trials for war crimes. I don't hear any discussion about more international arrest warrants. I don't hear any discussions about reparations. I don't hear any discussions about the Russians paying for what they've done. And until that enters into the equation, the entire discussion is incomplete.
It does seem, unfortunately, that this is the case. I mean, there have been even suggestions about lifting sanctions as the proverbial carrot, which would be dangled in front of Vladimir Putin if he actually agrees to certain terms in the course of the negotiations. But of course, all these matters, they constitute the totality of things, which would no doubt be high on the agenda of the future peace talks, or ceasefire talks, whatever we want to call them. Mark Toth, don't you think that the main problem, though, is still the question of security, still the question of how Ukraine is going to ensure that it remains a sustainable, prosperous state in the wake of any such agreement? Because we do know that most likely this will involve the loss of territory, even if it is theoretically temporary, to be regained by diplomatic means and not for warfare. That is the loss of production capabilities, resources, industry, and so on. And then there is the unresolved issues. Who's going to protect Ukraine from further attacks if, from what we can hear, NATO membership would not be on the table for the next couple of years, maybe more. And there is still ambiguity as to who would protect Ukraine during that time. What do you think is going to happen in this regard? Because there is still some chaos and still some uncertainty as to what exactly can we expect.
Yeah, Jonas, it's a great question. And Mr. Johnson, again, very smart to bring up the whole issue of NATO. Mick Ryan just said it a day ago, the retired general from Australia, that you can't reward Putin with territorial gains. It is bad enough, right? But if you let him have a check, if he gets a veto on who ultimately can join NATO, then what is the real true value of NATO? NATO is a defensive organization. That strength comes from its member states and comes from its independence and autonomy, if you will, from its enemies. And so the whole idea of saying that Ukraine needs to wait to join NATO, or if you were to take the Russian position as is now, that they can never be. Let's go back to that Medvedev's statement where he's basically saying that either Ukraine is part of Russia or it doesn't exist at all. They don't ever foresee the possibility of Ukraine being part of NATO. And then you get into those other areas where, Mr. Johnson is right to bring up this. We're seeing what the Russians want out of this. They basically want all four of the, what I call the sham referendum states, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, even though they don't control those completely. They want all of those at the negotiating table. Presumably they want the Kursk Oblast back as well. Everything that they want is what they want, but they're not paying any price here. And as Mr. Johnson was pointing out, there's no talk of war tribunals for the war crimes that have been prosecuted daily against Ukrainian civilians, attacking civilian infrastructure, targeting hospitals and the like. There's no talk in terms of who pays for all of this damage that's been done. Russia's not fighting a traditional war. This is not about combined arms warfare that NATO would fight. This is about terrorizing Ukrainian civilians on the home front and basically fighting a World War I style battle, along the Donbass, along this 1,100-kilometer front, if you will, and they're just destroying cities left and right. And so, there needs to be discussions here. If there's an ultimate peace to be had, who pays for that? Not just who pays for it in terms of dollars to Ukraine, but who goes to jail over the things and decisions that were made by Russians. And then, the only other thing that I point out, I do think in all this discussion about peace, from my perspective, looking at Russia, how many peace agreements has Putin since 2000? Has he ever honored? That answer is zero. So I think for a lot of us, that have watched Putin, has studied what he's doing, seen what he's been doing in the Mideast, what he's done in Africa, what he's attempting to do again in the Caucasus, and what we're seeing in real time in Georgia, this is not a man who's going to give up. This is not a man who looks at peace as something that's going to be permanent or lasting. This is someone who views it as a building block to do the next thing. And I think Europe, and especially, but also the U.S. and Trump in particular, needs to realize chasing all of this is probably fool's gold. I just don't see it. And I think Poland gets that. I think your country more than most understands this threat is not going away, even if we want to delude ourselves into a peace deal. At best, it's going to be a ceasefire deal, but I don't think it's a peace deal in the long run.
And Robin F. Johnson, we've seen Donald Trump making, again, contradictory gestures, like, for example, inviting Xi Jinping to the inauguration. Xi Jinping apparently snubbed that, but still, it is a gesture that has made the headlines. What do you think about his apparent desire to reach out to leaders like Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin? Is this something that we could call a fascination with the authoritarian side of governance? Or is it more about reaching out to your negotiating partners, like, in the business world, where you might positively despise a single person, not respect them at all, but you want to show them the courtesy, like, I am respecting that guy, I'm complimenting him, so that they perhaps feel like, all the necessities of maintaining appearances, they are being adhered to, right? But beneath that, the negotiations are still going to be the sort of no-holds-barred confrontation. It's just that it will not seem that way because of all the nice words being said by the parties involved.
Well, there is that old saying about, you keep your friends close, but you keep your enemies closer. I look at the invitation for Xi Jinping to the inauguration. It was a calculated snub because Xi Jinping was invited, but Putin was not. And and what's been happening in the last few days, there was a visit once again to Beijing by Dmitry Medvedev, who's the deputy head of the Security Council. And once again, if you read the Chinese press, not the Western, but the Chinese coverage of that visit, there was no mention of this being a state visit. There was no mention of Medvedev having been president for 4 years and prime minister for 8. There was no mention at all of government-to-government connections. This was presented as head of the United Russia Party meets the head of the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese are attempting to keep Putin and Russia at a distance so that they don't get slapped with secondary sanctions over the support they've given for Russia in this war, which is substantial. There's a lot of Chinese support, some of it directly, some of it going through Belarus, some of it going through Kyrgyzstan, some of it going through Kazakhstan. They've been playing this roundabout game for a long time. And I wouldn't have been surprised if Xi had showed up, if there wouldn't have been some background discussions between people in the new Trump administration and in Xi's entourage saying, you better cut this out or you're going to pay an economic price for it. We don't think we're so stupid that we don't see what you're doing.
So, Mark Toth, do you think that ultimately, perhaps, the fate of this conflict does not rest in the negotiations between Keith Kellogg and, Putin's henchmen, but actually between Trump and Xi Jinping, because it does seem like China, to a large extent, holds the key to much of Russia's continued ability to fight this war. Would you say that perhaps this is where the most important decisions might be made at some point, affecting not just this region, but also many others?
Yeah, I think if we were just looking at this on an isolated basis, you might argue that. But there's been a huge part of the former Trump administration that's made the argument that Washington has to pivot and protect Taiwan, and that it's a different kind of fight militarily in terms of what's being faced in Eastern Europe. So I think those tension points are going to be caused. And so from that standpoint, I'm not so sure that I buy in to the idea being floated by some that Trump and Xi are going to solve Ukraine. I think that also takes off the table the potential role that the EU is seeing. I mean, you've got a new head of NATO, which is obviously separate and distinct from the EU, Mark Rutte, who's basically saying, look, we need to be fearing what Europe looks like 4 to 5 years out. And he's making the argument for increased spending going past the 2% point to the 3% point of GDP for NATO member states. To be able to confront a future Russian threat in the East. And so from that standpoint, I think the EU is going to have a big say too. And it's important to remember because I think sometimes here in the United States, we overlook this, but the EU has a massive trading balance with China as well. So I think the three are all interconnected and are all going to play out. Now, obviously, there is a lot of political discord right now happening in Europe. You've got a new French prime minister. You've got a weakened, French president. You've got elections coming up in late February in Germany, where it looks like Friedrich Merz is ahead. And so there's a big dynamic there where, yes, right now, during this critical beginning of these negotiations, if you will, if that's what happens, there's a bit of a vacuum in the EU, but I expect at some point that'll get filled. So just my personal take, I could be wrong, but I don't think this is going to come down to Xi and Trump deciding this. I think it's more complicated than that. And I don't think we can overlook that at this point, Zelenskyy, despite bad morale, despite crushing losses that are happening on an incremental basis in the East, I don't think he's anywhere close to being prepared, nor are most of his country people, to giving up what Putin is demanding. I just don't see that. So even if Trump and Xi were to agree on some kind of master peace plan, I'm not sure that you could get Ukraine to fall in the line, and that they wouldn't be looking to EU member states to try to supplement. And we've already seen different presidents, different prime ministers, et cetera, from the EU saying, look, we'll supplement what the U.S. might not do under Trump.
And of course, let me be clear, I did not see this potential situation as an opportunity. It is more of a threat, really, because if Xi Jinping, Donald Trump, any other world leaders actually sat down and agreed upon anything above the heads of Ukrainians, that would have robbed them of the agency. And, arguably, they should be the ones deciding their own fate and nobody else. That is why perhaps President Zelenskyy was so angry at Viktor Orban, who was once again trying to decide the future of Ukraine by calling Vladimir Putin. Also, the European Union was not really satisfied with this. Speaking of which, Robin F. Johnson, there was an excellent point raised. Yes?
Yeah, real quick, Jonas.
Sure.
You and I are on the same page. I agree with you absolutely. Right. Yeah, this is not an opportunity, but it's a threat.
So now, moving to the European Union, because there was an excellent point raised here. Robin F. Johnson, would you say the European Union is punching above or below its weight? Because we do have massive military support to Ukraine from European Union countries. Poland, in the early stages of the war, allowed Ukraine to survive. Perhaps if it wasn't for Poland's military support, things might have been very different. But also, we have this problem of the decision-making process sometimes being a bit convoluted, sometimes being a bit slow. We have Russia trying, for example, to steal elections in Romania recently, and already having two countries vaguely on its side, speaking, of course, of Slovakia and Hungary. So the decision-making processes sometimes might be derailed by these countries, of course, under the guise of working for peace instead of escalating the war and so on. So do you think the European Union is aware of this? Because naturally we may say, we need to be ready for the challenges of tomorrow, but what if our opponents and other players in this game are already there and the European Union is still, winding up for this upcoming challenge of being able to confront its adversaries?
Oh, I'm an old defense industry guy for many years. And while many European countries are prepared to support Ukraine diplomatically, and yes, you're correct, without Poland, Ukraine probably wouldn't still be around today. I mean, Poland is a standout If there was an award for best in class, Poland would have received it for all the work it's done to improve its military buying, new military hardware, and so on. But the European defense industrial base is woefully inadequate. I mean, not just the level of spending, of course, but the actual hardware being procured and how long these procurement cycles are, like the Eurofighter that's being shown on the screen now. This is a program that took 3 or 4 times longer than it was supposed to progress until you reached the point where you got into full-scale production. And even today, you still find bickering among European countries on programs like the Next Generation Fighter, which there are 2.5 of those programs out there competing with one another when there should be one European program all by itself. So I see this as a huge weakness because the politicians in Europe have not figured out defense industry is something that you have in your own national interest. It's perhaps not the most cost-effective thing in the world. It perhaps at times seems to cost tremendous amounts of money, and you don't feel like you're getting your money's worth out of it. But the defense industrial base is not a just add water proposition. You have to support it. You have to maintain it. You have to have a cadre of specialists and engineers and designers that are in place, who are kept busy, who are working, so that when you get into a time of military conflict, you have surge capacity to be able to expand production in the shortest time frame possible. Most people have forgotten what that's all about. And so if there's a lesson learned here, it's that the sort of lackadaisical approach of the last 20 years or more that, well, gee, if we just pretend Russia's not a problem, it won't be. Those days are over. And you have to be prepared for anything that Russia might conceivably do. They are definitely out of the bounds of behavior for countries that believe in the civilized, internationally based rules order.
So, Mark Toth, this raises the question of resilience, right? We've had the example of Romania recently fighting back against a synchronized, coordinated effort to derail the democratic process. Other countries should perhaps be taking note. The question is, are they? And also, are they aware of what Mr. Johnson has just mentioned? That there are inadequacies in the manufacturing process, in the industrial base, and so on. Things that were there during the Cold War have been basically allowed to languish. Some equipment was put in storage or sold or even sent to the scrapyard. Do we still have enough time to get out of this stupor that we have found ourselves in? At least, talking collectively about the whole European continent here.
May I say something about Romania, about that situation, just for a second? I'm sorry to interrupt my colleague. Look, you have to understand the way the Russians operate with what we call hybrid warfare, with the things that they do that are not direct kinetic threats to European Union countries. The Russians have at least over 1 million cyber warriors, computer hackers, computer pirates, whatever you want to call them, working for about 30 or 40 different cybercrime gangs. And they have a deal with the Russian government. And the Russian government says, okay, you guys can do whatever you want. You can go steal $250 million out of the Bangladesh Central Bank. You can go and hack into the credit card database for Best Buy in America. You can do whatever you want. And we won't touch you. When the authorities in these Western countries come to us and they say, oh my God, there's a cybercrime gang operating here in Russia, we'll say, oh yes, we're as shocked as you are. And they'll feign some sort of very, very deep concern, and they'll promise to do something, but they won't do anything. So you have over 1 million criminals operating, carrying out these activities all the time. And the deal with the Russian government is you can steal whatever you want, you can do whatever commit whatever criminal acts you want. We, the Russian government, won't touch you. But when the time comes along that we need some dirty work done, you're going to do that for us for free. That's the quid pro quo. Now, we don't have a response for that because we're Western countries that believe in the rule of law. We can't go out and hire 1 million criminals to do our dirty work. So the question is, what's the response to that? And number two, When does that type of activity reach to the level where it demands a kinetic response?
So these are some very pertinent questions. As one of the European leaders recently said, Western European leaders, I have to add, we are simply being too polite. So coming back to what I was talking about just a moment ago, Mark Toth, do you think that Europe will be able to, galvanize itself into action before a costly confrontation may ensue?
Fortunately, when you look at the Russian military, their own procurement process, the challenges that Mr. Johnson was raising earlier to the economy, I think they've got the time. But as the son of and grandson of fighter pilots, commercial and military, that were later then involved in the defense industry, I can attest that Mr. Johnson is exactly right, that the timeline for procurement is long. For the development, the design, rolling them out, all of that takes a long time. So the time to act is now. It's not to wait. We've already seen in simplistic terms the problem of not being prepared. When you look at the massive shortages, in some cases on a 10-to-1 advantage to the Russians, granted they're getting some of these from North Korea, but they're able to outproduce the West in some cases 10-to-1 or procure. From North Korea, 10-to-1 artillery shells, mortar shells. And we still haven't, to use the word that Mr. Johnson used, surged sufficiently enough in the West to meet that demand. We need to do a better job in the U.S., and Europe needs to do a far better job as well. So Europe has time, but it's time to act. It's not time to keep saying, let's take another year at this. And I think, Poland, again, you have set the gold standard in terms of it. And with the research facility that NATO has set up inside of your country now to learn from the battlefield from Ukraine, I think will go a long ways. And for people that doubt that, if they don't understand just how much of a multiplier that kind of technology can be, I'd remind them to go back and take a look at Israel and the technology that they've been able to develop from basically being a country that's perpetually at war. That technology transformation to the military has been immense. And for instance, I think, this is one example of how much that can change. A lot of us were curious whether or not you'd see the negation of the tank on the battlefield in Gaza in the same way that we saw drones take them down in Ukraine, but we didn't. The Israelis found solutions to that with a far superior electronics warfare thing. So Europe has time, but only if they get their act together now.
So there are examples to follow. One that is closer to home is the Cold War. It's been done before, winning that confrontation, but it takes determination and, of course, sometimes some tough decisions, which need to be made as soon as possible. Mark Toth and Royben F. Johnson were our guests today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for your contributions.
Thank you to both of you. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And so another episode of Ukraine This Week comes to a close. Join us at the same time next week for more updates from Ukraine. I'm Jonasz Rewnicki. Bye for now.